everyone, welcome to our NBC Online Bible Study. My name is Matthew McGlade. I'm the lead and teaching pastor here at Mansfield Pentecostal Church. And every Tuesday night we have our thought to think about, a question to ponder, a text to study as we study the scriptures together. And as I say every week, if you're part of a life group, you can use this teaching tonight to help you with your discussion in your life group. Or if not, you want to watch it on your own, you can, but obviously it's always better in the context of a small group as we learn together. Now, we've been doing this very long series for quite a few months actually, titled The Hope of the World, and we're looking at the doctrine of the teaching of the church. We're looking at the function, the purpose of the church, its governance, its relationship with the state, the authority of the church, and we've covered all sorts of issues, a whole wide range of topics within that. And then recently we've been looking at the means of grace within the church, i.e. the activities in the church that become a means of grace to help us in a spiritual walk. And then recently, as part of that, we've been doing a mini-series on the spiritual gifts. And we're looking at what the spiritual gifts are, how we can discover our spiritual gifts. Are they for today or are they not, which I believe they are. And remember that last week we looked at a definition of some of the gifts of the Spirit, particularly the ones that Paul mentions in 1 Corinthians 12. Now we're going to be continuing our study on the spiritual gifts. We've nearly finished, and then we'll nearly finish the whole section on the church. But what I want to do tonight, I want to look at the question of how can we seek the spiritual gifts, because I believe the gifts of the Spirit are something that we can seek. Now you remember that the second teaching that we did on this subsection on the spiritual gifts is we looked at how to discover and grow in our spiritual gifts. And as part of that, we assume that the gifts of the Spirit are something that the Spirit of God has already given us. And therefore, we can operate in those gifts. And more often than not, that there are certain gifts that the Spirit of God uses you more than in other gifts. However, I do believe that it is possible for us to seek after spiritual gifts in our own lives that we may not already currently have. And I believe that is something that we can do, and actually the New Testament encourages us to do. But in seeking the spiritual gifts, we must always remember that it is the Holy Spirit who distributes the gifts according to his will. The Apostle Paul says when writing to the Corinthians, all of these, speaking of the gifts of the Spirit, are work of one and the same Spirit, and he distributes them each one according to his will. Now, before we kind of look at how we can seek the spiritual gifts, obviously this text that I've just read by Paul raises the whole thorny issue of whether it is possible for one Christian impart another spiritual gift into another. Is that possible? Now, on two occasions in the New Testament, Paul would seem to suggest that spiritual gifts can be imparted from one person to another. When writing to Timothy, he instructs him to not neglect your gift, which was given you through prophecy when the body of elders laid their hands on you. So, in that prophetic atmosphere, the elders of the church, or the pastors, which I've referred to in the past, prayed for Timothy, and obviously there was a prophetic word that was given, and Paul would seem to indicate that a spiritual gift, was imparted to Timothy during that time. In his letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul says, I long to see you that I may impart to you some spiritual gift to make you strong. And so it would seem, wouldn't it, that on one occasion, Paul is saying that the gifts of the Spirit are distributed according to his will. The writer of Hebrews also says the same thing in Hebrews 2, that the gifts of the Spirit are distributed by the discretion of the Holy Spirit, and yet at the same time, it would seem that Paul felt at liberty to impart spiritual gifts to people in different circumstances. So how can a man, and in this case Paul, be an instrument of impartation? Well, the answer to this question surely must be that provided a person is truly led by the Spirit of God, by the Spirit of the Lord, in praying for another person, they may feel led to impart or a spiritual gift. It might be that they feel imparted or prompted by the Spirit of God to impart a gift of the Spirit into that person's life. So give you an example of this. Let's, for example, see the gift of healing, or the gifts of healing that I mentioned last week. Now, are gifts of healing, are they a work of God or are they a work of man? Well, of course they're a work of God, okay? They are gifts that come from the Holy Spirit. The Holy Spirit can give a gift of healing for a particular condition. And so clearly they are a work of God. Yet at the same time, Jesus instructed his disciples to heal the sick. When he said, heal those who are ill, raise the dead, cleanse those who have leprosy, drive out demons, freely you receive, freely give. So who was doing the healing? Was it God or was it the disciples? Well, in a sense, ultimately, yes, it is God who does the healing, and yet God in his sovereignty has chosen to use human agents to be the instruments of imparting that gift of healing into someone else. So in a sense, it's both as well as it ultimately being God. It is both God and human agency bringing the healing in that situation. A similar can be seen in the immersion of the Holy Spirit, or baptism of the Holy Spirit. Who baptizes in the Holy Spirit? Well, it's not man, it's Jesus. It is Jesus who baptizes in the Holy Spirit. And we see that on numerous occasions in the Gospel. John says, I baptize you with water, but one will come after you, me, who will baptize in the Holy Spirit, referring to Jesus. And yet we read in the book of Acts, particularly, that the Holy Spirit was given through the laying on of hands. When Peter and John arrived at Samaria, it was seen that the Spirit was given at the laying on of the apostles' hands. Now, this does not contradict the overall truth that it is the Lord Jesus who immerses people in the Holy Spirit, yet at the same time he uses human agency through that, in this case in the laying on of hands. So in the light of this, it is perfectly appropriate if you desire a particular spiritual gift, let's say the gift of prophecy, to ask someone who you know is used in the gift of prophecy to pray for you and ask that God will impart that gift into your life and use you in that area. And so, seeking the spiritual gifts, an important step of that is actually understanding that gifts can be imparted by the Holy Spirit through individuals to help us to further us in our walk with God. Now, what I want to do is I want to just share some brief steps, things that we could all take to seek the spiritual gifts. The first thing is that we could do is we could adopt a right attitude. Remember that in seeking the gifts of the Spirit, we are receiving gifts. These aren't things that we can earn by our efforts. There's no sense of entitlement. We have no right to feel that God owes us or is obligated to give us a spiritual gift. These are gifts of the Spirit of God, and so we can earnestly desire them, we can seek them in our lives, but I think it's really important to understand that they are gifts of grace. They are gifts of God's grace given to us in each case, and therefore we need to remove any sense of entitlement and as if God owes us these gifts. In relation to this, we also need to keep in mind that gifts of the Spirit aren't sort of optional extras, okay? They are given so that God can use us to edify and build up the church and to reach the lost with the mission of Christ. They're not given to stroke our own ego or to look at how good we are or to draw attention to ourselves. They are manifestations that are given by the Holy Spirit for the common good. And so in many ways they are given for the good of the church and for the mission of the church. And so, as I mentioned, they're not to be an optional extra. They are to be that which is eagerly desired. The Apostle Paul says, now eagerly desire the greater gifts, obviously referring to prophecy. Okay, later on he says, eagerly desire the gifts of the Spirit, especially prophecy. Why? Because prophecy is a spiritual gift. It's a gift that builds other people up and edifies them in their faith. Third thing that we can take in seeking the spiritual gifts is that pray that we may receive them. It's appropriate to ask the Holy Spirit, Lord, I would like to be used in these spiritual gifts. I'd love you to use me in a gift of healing or in a word of knowledge or a word of wisdom. and just open yourself up to the Holy Spirit to be used by that as and when the occasion may arise. You remember that Paul said in 1 Corinthians 14 that if you pray in a tongue in public, that the one who speaks in a tongue should pray that they may interpret what they say. And so there's two gifts of operation. There's the gift of tongues, but there's also a gift of interpretation. And so it's very appropriate to ask the Lord, help me to interpret what I've just said. That's praying to receive a spiritual gift. And so it's appropriate to ask the Holy Spirit for the gifts. Remember, it's the Holy Spirit who distributes the gifts. And I believe that the Holy Spirit desires to and wants to. And sometimes I believe that it's more so that he will do so to those who are seeking the gifts in their life and ministry. Also, another thing that we need to do, if we want to seek the spiritual gifts, is that we must exercise faith. Gifts of tongues, healings are promised for those who believe. Those who prophesy, Paul says in Romans, must do so according to your faith. And so there really is a pattern or correlation between, to the extent that you step out of faith, trusting God and believing God, and being used in those gifts and using the spiritual gifts. And sometimes if we were to act out of how we feel in a given moment, we may not always step out of faith. Sometimes it's actually stepping out in faith even when we don't feel that we have anything to give or to bring, that the Holy Spirit can actually minister in that situation and give us something when we really didn't feel like we had anything to give. And when we're willing to step out, sometimes when we're willing to go out and limb, be it in our personal witness or in evangelism, or praying for someone, and you just, maybe it's just one word you have, and have a word of encouragement, and you have nothing else to go on. And sometimes you just step out on that and exercise faith in that. The Holy Spirit can sometimes release more of that gift in our life. And then finally, another thing, a practical thing that we can do to step out in the spiritual gifts is to seek the spiritual gifts, is to seek the right atmosphere. There's a story, isn't there, in the Gospels where Jesus couldn't perform many miracles, particularly in his hometown of Nazareth, because there was an atmosphere of unbelief amongst the people that he was healing. In fact, they said he only can heal a few people. Well, I'll have a few people, but he can only heal a few people because of the unbelief that the place where he was at. And actually, there's a sense that the atmosphere that we're in can either quench the Holy Spirit, which is possible to do, or can actually have an atmosphere of faith and expectation and love where the gifts of the Holy Spirit can flow. And so if you're in a church where the leadership doesn't believe in the gifts of the Spirit, they're cessationists, they no longer believe that are available today, that obviously is not going to help, isn't it, in terms of expecting to see the gifts of the Spirit being cultivated and used. And so in the right atmosphere, where there's belief that the gifts of the Spirit are relevant for today, an atmosphere of faith, of love, of encouragement, in that sort of atmosphere, we can expect to see the spiritual gifts to flourish and to blossom. And so, if you're not in a church that doesn't believe in the operation of the gifts of the Spirit, let me encourage you to step in those gifts, or to be part of a church that does believe that. And so, in your day-to-day interactions with unbelievers, in the small groups, in your life groups, in corporate gatherings, I want to encourage you to open your heart to the Holy Spirit, to seek the Spirit of God, and to be receptive to Him, and to be open to the gifts of the Spirit. And in doing so, I believe actually it'd be of great value and great benefit to the wider church as a whole. So that's what we're looking at, just in terms of our thought to think about, in terms of seeking the gifts of the Spirit. Just a question to ponder in your life groups. I'd like you to discuss this question. The question is as follows: of the 4 steps mentioned, adopting a right attitude, praying for the gifts of the Spirit, stepping out in faith, seeking a right atmosphere, which one could you better hone to be more receptive to the gifts of the Spirit? So which one could you better hone to be more receptive to the gifts of the Spirit? And guys, a text I would like you to read 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 1 to 5. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verses 1 to 5. And the question I'd like you to discuss in your groups is, why should you eagerly desire the gifts of the Spirit? Guys, thanks for listening tonight. I hope you got something out of that. God bless you, and see you later. Bless you. Bye.